A diligent young woman goes into work on a Saturday.
To encounter somebody in a pink fluffy scarf, somebody saying, no, don't do that, would have driven his rage to a point of no return.
A bloodbath in a London office.
We followed these drag marks in blood down the corridor to a shower room.
It's an horrific crime scene, and New Scotland Yard must bring a murderer to justice. At 2 p.m. on Saturday the 13th of January 2007, Cathy Marlow, a young professional from New Zealand, was due to have lunch with her flatmate. Cathy had recently returned from a holiday in Egypt and was keen to catch up on work at Research Now, a company based near the Oval Cricket Ground in South London. At 1:36 p.m, Cathy called to confirm lunch, but she never turned up. Her worried flatmate rang a mutual friend who also worked at the building to ask him to check on Cathy to make sure she was okay. When he arrives at the office, he finds her dead in a pool of blood in the ground floor shower. The senior New Scotland Yard detective in charge of the case was Damien Allain.
From my perspective, I always prepare before I go in. I just pause for a moment, you know, to try and anticipate what I'm going to be looking at. I went in, it was an horrific scene. There was blood on the walls, there was blood on the floor. I mean, it was clear that there was a struggle, a violent struggle.
Cathy was described as a really happy, bubbly girl. She was from New Zealand, over here in London, developing her work experience and using the city as her base. At the time, Vauxhall was a very popular area for young professionals and students, and particularly people coming over from New Zealand. This crime was a huge shock to the overseas community living there.
This crime was shocking in its brutality. It appeared at first glance to be completely random. An office worker killed in the reception area of her company, near the headquarters of MI6.
"28-year-old Cathy Marlow was found dead in a shower at her office last Saturday.
It was a there but for the grace of God go I moment. Cathy Marlow had gone to the office on a weekend because she'd been on holiday. She wanted to catch up with her work. She wanted to be diligent. She wanted to be a good worker. And that cost her life.
It was a Saturday, with very few workers around and London's ever-present traffic noise. There was little chance anyone would hear Cathy's screams for help.
It became apparent that the attack site was in and around the entrance, the communal entrance to the building. And then we followed these drag marks in blood down the corridor to a shower room, and Cathy's body was found in the shower of the shower room with a ligature around her neck. It was a scarf. There'd been evidence, I mean, there was a strong smell of bleach, and there was evidence of a clean-up operation by the suspect who'd attempted to, you know, get rid of the evidence, try and clean the blood, but there was just too much of it.
Despite being hit repeatedly with a heavy object, the eventual cause of death was strangulation. In a vile twist, Cathy Marlow had been strangled by her own scarf, a gift from her mother.
Obviously, the family were completely devastated when they heard this news. They had to get on a plane and face this terrible reality thousands of miles away. and Cathy's mother at the time was terminally ill with cancer. So really this was a terrible time, just tragedy heaped upon tragedy.
We had no idea of who might be responsible, what the motive was. There was no CCTV directly on the premises. There were no eyewitnesses.
The UK is one of the most surveilled countries in the world. There were hundreds of cameras in the vicinity of the South London office, any one of which could have captured an image of Cathy's killer.
We took possession of hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of footage. Do we start to view this footage, which is very resource intensive? But then that's like looking for a needle in a haystack, because we've got no eyewitness accounts. We don't know who the suspect is, what the suspect looks like.
Damien Allain took the decision to not look at all the CCTV until he had an idea about who or what to look for. The new Scotland Yard murder squad set about developing a theory around what may have happened. Key is what the crime scene reveals.
New Zealander Cathy Marlow was living her dream by working in London, but last Saturday she was found dead in a shower at her offices here in Kennington.
I'm totally open-minded as to who might be responsible for this. It may be a work colleague, it may be a stranger, we don't know. The only person that can tell you what's happened is the person who's been murdered and the perpetrator. I took the decision that we were going to invest a lot of time in the forensic retrieval and the examination of that building. But the biggest challenge in this investigation was the sheer scale of the crime scene.
The challenging thing about a scene like this, with office workers coming and going, is preservation. To stop contamination, you have to keep everyone away. A team of forensic experts is pulled together and they begin a minute examination of every square inch of the building.
The SIO will know full well that probably 80% plus of his evidence for that case is going to come from that crime scene. That huge building with 3 floors and multiple offices in it, we don't know where those suspect or suspects have been. So that whole area has to be screened and looked at.
We had in excess of 100 different forensic examiners and experts, from fingerprint experts to DNA experts to blood pattern analysis experts, crime scene managers, photographers. So we could, as much as we could, try and interpret what had happened at that scene and then retrieve, any evidence.
The forensic team's first job is to tell the story of the encounter itself. How many perpetrators? Did Cathy die instantly, or did she fight for her life? And was she killed where her body was found?
The blood pattern analyst can work out a specific order of when things happened and where a person was, so they can look at what caused that blood stain or spatter or smear, and also not forgetting that if the victim is bleeding, then it's highly likely that the suspect or suspects will have blood on them as they exit the scene. If it bleeds, it leads.
This afternoon, the investigation continues into how 28-year-old Cathy Marlow, a New Zealander, died. There was a 999 call at about 9:30 on Saturday night, and when police arrived, they found Cathy's body here in the shower. Now, they think she was killed at some point during Saturday afternoon, and they're appealing for witnesses to come forward. They want to hear from anybody who might have seen somebody, perhaps marked with bloodstains.
The police had few initial clues. To assist the investigation, they asked Cathy's family to appear on camera and make a public appeal for help in finding the killer of their precious daughter and much-loved sister.
The police were hoping that they could make a public appeal, but they were very private people and they didn't want to put themselves forward. And of course, it goes without saying that they were in pieces over her death. When there's that personal angle, when there's a family member making an appeal. When the police don't have that in their arsenal, so to speak, it can make generating publicity and therefore generating leads on a murder case more difficult.
We spoke to her flatmates, we spoke to colleagues, and on any view, there was no suggestion she had any enemies.
Why would someone do this to Cathy? Friends, colleagues, and all the other people who worked at her company needed to be questioned. There were over 100 people who worked in the Research Now building. Forensic samples were taken. Details of their whereabouts and alibis were recorded.
Of all the people working at Research Now, there was one person who didn't have an alibi. That was the man who found Cathy's body. This was the friend that Cathy's flatmate had called, and he said he'd walked to Research Now, walked to the offices, and found her body.
So the first person arrested in this investigation was presented to me as a suspect in the case because he'd already been arrested at the scene prior to me accepting responsibility for the investigation. He worked alongside Catherine in Research Now. He found Catherine in the shower cubicle.
Murder investigations are high-stakes situations. This man could have killed Cathy, or he could have just been a concerned friend who'd found her body, this appalling, bloody scene, and is now being treated as a suspect.
His behaviour was deemed to be over-helpful in terms of the officer's interpretation of his behaviour at the scene, and it was on that basis I think they took the decision to arrest at that time.
Cathy's work colleague had been arrested on the grounds of being overly helpful and knowing where the body was. But Detective Damien Allain had a gut feeling about the murder.
You have to build a reasonable hypothesis to have a focused investigation. So you've got to start, theorising to some extent about what you think might have happened. And I think from the outset it was likely to have been an intruder. It didn't look as though it was a targeted attack at Catherine. It was not normal for office staff to be in on a Saturday. My view was that Catherine had disturbed him and that had then resulted in her being attacked.
One of Damien's first actions as the detective in charge was to question the suspect.
The officers who'd first responded considered his status to be suspicious at that time. Perhaps he was in shock. But the best I could do, having been presented with this, was to implicate him or eliminate him. There was absolutely no evidence that he was in any way responsible. I apologised for what he'd been through. He accepted that that was what happened.
There was nothing to link Cathy's friend to her murder. Scotland Yard detectives came up with a working hypothesis that an intruder may be the culprit responsible. 2 days in, as the investigations team worked methodically through every office in the building, they wanted to know if anything had been stolen.
It was a couple of days into the inquiry that we established that a number of laptops had gone missing. We were starting at that point to get a motive that it was an office burglary.
This guy was prepared to murder Cathy, dump her body in the shower, and having done that, trudge around an extremely bloody, horrific crime scene and steal a few laptops. This is a dangerous man. People are scared and he's on the loose.
As the investigation progresses bit by bit, forensic experts paint a clearer picture of what they believe happened.
We were clear that certainly most of the blood must have come from the victim because she had a serious head injury that had bled. Because we could see the drag marks in blood, it became apparent that it was likely that it was the victim's blood in the main.
All the signs point to a prolonged and violent attack. So violent that the perpetrator may have been left with some kind of injury. So the team would be looking for a trace of him, anywhere he'd been, walls, stairs or attack site. We know the killer is cruel and ruthless, but we also know he's someone who takes risks.
What's utterly incredible here is the way in which the attacker, after having carried out this brutal murder, then proceeds to calmly carry on with the robbery of the laptops. How is this possible? What I think we're dealing with here, to me, has an almost kamikaze feel. It's utterly reckless. It's almost akin to a suicide. There's a quality to it which is somebody who is pulling the house down, who's given up totally, who's destroying everything and anything, who's totally driven by an absolute destructive urge. And Cathy got in the way.
Whether Catherine knew the intruder or not, we weren't sure.
Sometimes it's not what you find, but what you find is missing that can drive an inquiry forward. The team noticed that a crucial piece of evidence that could lead straight to Cathy's killer isn't present at the crime scene.
What we tried to do is piece together Catherine's movements that day, and we know from a flatmate that she left her flat nearby at about 9 o'clock. We know she was a creature of habit, that she went into the coffee shop, which was almost diagonally opposite to the business premises. From that footage, we could see that she was carrying a handbag, and we couldn't locate that handbag in the building.
We have a handbag that belonged to Catherine that is missing. It is brown leather, it's about 10 inches by 10 inches. It has a flap over the top of it, and this is sealed with a dome-shaped clasp.
Cathy's handbag was crucial in this investigation. It could still have been in the killer's possession, or it could have been dumped somewhere, covered in his DNA.
Information then came in when detectives asked her bank to examine her accounts. Someone had tried to use Cathy's bank card after she'd been killed, and now the Yard had a CCTV image of the person using it. Was this man her killer?
An image had been captured of the person who tried to use that card. So straight away we had a potential suspect. We circulated that image internally within the police service, and two separate officers came forward and gave us the same name, naming the individual as Daniel Kennedy. A quick bit of research identified that he had previous convictions for petty thefts, and he was due at court that very day that the information came in. So I made a decision that he would be arrested on suspicion of murder at that point, because he's in possession of stolen property very shortly after the murder's taken place. His account is that he was walking at a street nearby, Vauxhall Street, with Linda Profit, who was his partner, and they happened upon this bag in the street. And he decided he was going to steal that bag and take it back to his home address, and then he ended up using one of these cards.
Damien Allain, the senior investigator, has to make a really important judgment about whether to believe the suspect's story or not.
He took us back to his home address, located the handbag for us, which became important in terms of evidence inside the contents of that bag. He was interviewed by two very experienced detectives on my team. It was their view that his account was credible. On the basis of all the research we'd done about his background, that seemed logical. We still went through the process of, okay, well, where were you on the date and time of the murder? What were your movements? We still took forensic samples from him because we still want to eliminate him from the scene. So, yes, we believe him, but it has to be evidence-based. He was charged in the connection with handling stolen property. So he was bailed, but he was subsequently eliminated from the investigation as a suspect.
Cathy's handbag had ended up in the hands of a petty thief, a chancer, but not a murderer. So it's back to the drawing board for detectives, which in this case is forensics. A post-mortem is carried out on Cathy's body. Despite the injuries from repeated blows with a blunt instrument, the cause of death has been confirmed to be asphyxiation. The team are now searching for any traces of the attacker on her body.
One of the best pieces of evidence you're going to get in a homicide, unfortunately, is the victim. The last person that was being in contact with that victim was the perpetrator or the perpetrators. Evidence we know gets trapped under fingernails, fibres, skin, blood, just about everything. Vital pieces of evidence.
It was at that point that we got our break, because we had a result that came in from the post-mortem samples that had been submitted to the laboratory. I actually remember the day like it was yesterday. It was a Friday evening. We found 2 DNA samples under 2 separate fingernails, which both match one male person.
If there was a violent struggle, then you would expect a large amount of suspect offender DNA under the fingernails of the victim. DNA can get under anyone's fingernails. It can be social contact, partners, or working together, for example. Or if there was a large source of DNA on a surface and I touched that large source of DNA, then there's potential for that to transfer under my fingernails.
The genetic material under Cathy's fingernails is going to be the best chance of getting a breakthrough on this case. But in order to do so, New Scotland Yard need to get a match.
And they were about to get one. The samples belonged to a man who had recently been arrested and cautioned for being drunk and disorderly.
When that name came into the equation, we were able to establish that actually he'd been a former employee of Research Now, where Catherine had worked in that building. So he was a former employee who'd been sacked 6 months previously because he was considered to be unreliable. But of course the question arose, well, could he have been having a relationship with Catherine?
The police certainly had a great many questions for suspect number 3.
Matthew Fagan was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Matthew Fagan denied any involvement in Cathy Marlow's killing, and he also denied burglary. But police finally had what they had been waiting for, a face to search for in the thousands of hours of CCTV, starting in the streets close to the murder scene. They got a result. A man that could be Fagan was walking along a nearby street in the direction of Research Now, just before the murder took place. That same individual is then seen on the return journey with what appears to be a laden backpack.
When police showed Fagan the CCTV images, he denied it was him, despite the strong resemblance, and he said he'd been in another part of London, Lewisham, that night and had actually been mugged, been slightly injured and gone to hospital, and reported the muggy incident to police.
He's gone to a Guy's hospital to get treatment, so it's logged at the hospital.
Fagan is easily recognisable on Guy's Hospital CCTV. The street footage next to Research Now is less clear. At this point, the investigator turned to another professional for specialist help.
You looked at the picture and thought, well, is it him or not? I thought it was. But what was crucial is that he had an unusual gait in terms of how he walked. It was almost like a limp. So what I did then, I contacted a forensic podiatrist.
A forensic podiatrist is someone who studies the unique way people walk and carry themselves. It can be used as an additional means of identification.
He said that is the same individual. So that became key in terms of, that CCTV. You are near the scene of the murder, at or about the time of the murder. So he couldn't have been in Lewisham. being mugged. And clearly he fabricated this because he'd had a head injury, which he had to account for, but equally he had to account for an alibi to take him away from the scene.
The senior detective is a man on a mission. He is convinced that Fagan was at the crime scene at the same time as Cathy Marlow, and that he's lying about the mugging. He believes that the head injury came about because Cathy Marlow was fighting for her life during the violent struggle. And he's certain Fagan attempted to clean up the crime scene and used the men's room to wash the blood off himself before he walked out with the laptops. Fagan is the prime suspect, but what's his motive? Would any man kill so violently for some laptops?
So you get disturbed as a burglar. What would possess somebody to then go on and kill somebody? And he had no previous convictions either. You think,
we know that Fagan had been sacked. We know that Fagan was now bankrupt. And what this train of events could trigger is a total destructive meltdown. This is somebody who feels utterly wronged and who is now prepared to do anything and everything to retaliate, who feels their sense of pride has been totally damaged and is now doing anything he can to reinstate that sense of power.
Fagan is the prime suspect. Police believe it's him. But as to motive, all there are a few stolen laptops. You know, we're not talking about £1 million in a suitcase.
Matthew Fagan is still denying everything. For the senior detective to build a strong case, he needs more evidence. It was down to forensics, and once again, they delivered the goods.
we managed to find blood, which was Fagan's DNA, underneath the desks where he's stolen the computers from. So as he's gone underneath to unplug the computers from the sockets, he's depressed a blood mark on the underside of the desks, which we were able to retrieve, and subsequently they turned out to be Matthew Fagan's DNA.
At this point, Fagan finally admitted to police that he had entered Research Now intending to steal the laptops, but he then said he'd gone with a group of others to commit the burglary, and that one of them must have killed Cathy. In this situation, police have got to remain focused and keep accumulating evidence.
His position was, I went there to burgle those premises with other people. Catherine disturbed us. At that point, I decided I was going to have nothing more to do with this, and his position is I walked away, so in other words, it must be down to them and not me.
What we see is someone who can see nothing, feel nothing but his own pain, and he is seeking to blame others, to blame the world, to blame anyone for that pain. So when he has these head injuries, albeit that they are the product of his own violent murder, they present Fagan with an opportunity to put himself in the position of the wronged victim. And that's a position where he feels very comfortable, where he feels that life has put him. He wants to be the wronged victim. He sees himself, he sees his life as one in which he has been attacked by life. Life has destroyed him. He's been sacked. He's become bankrupt. So he's looking to blame anything and anyone.
Matthew Fagan's weaving a web of deceit to try to throw the police off. Firstly, he's claimed he wasn't at the scene, but in hospital with head injuries after being mugged. Then he says it's not him on the CCTV outside Research Now. Next, he goes back on his story, claiming he only went to steal laptops and he was with other people. They must have killed Cathy, but the forensic examination of the crime scene has produced a wealth of evidence, and it's stacking up against Fagan. It's his DNA under Cathy Marlow's fingernails. and his blood is found under the desk from a head injury he received, probably when fighting Cathy. And laptops are missing from the office. And as the evidence mounts up, he keeps changing his story. The police think they've got their man, and they charge Fagan with Cathy's murder. But to build a watertight case, they need more. Senior Detective Damien Allain is determined to make sure Fagan doesn't get away with this.
A case like that, you live and breathe it. I mean, you go home, you go to bed thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it. Sometimes you dream about it, you know, you thinking, what am I going to do tomorrow? And you do very much live and breathe some of these cases.
Back at the crime scene, every millimetre is being checked for signs of Fagan. He must have left some trace behind. Something that can be used to convict him beyond all reasonable doubt. Forensics came through once again. They found the tiniest piece of flesh on the wall where the attack took place.
We know there was a struggle. We found the tiniest fleck of flesh with a hair on it on the wall in that immediate area where Catherine had been attacked.
DNA from the hair identified Matthew Fagan, and Damien Allain began to build a picture of what happened in the struggle between him and Cathy Marlow.
It was evident that there'd been a big struggle there. Catherine was clearly fighting for her life at that point, I think. She disturbed him. Catherine was reasonably short. Fagan was a tall guy. He was in excess of 6 foot. He was quite strong. He was a heavy individual. And you know, a blunt instrument was used. We think a hammer was used, which we never recovered. He was clearly intent on causing a serious bodily injury. And eventually he strangled her.
There were still loose ends that needed to be tied up. Matthew Fagan had confessed to stealing the laptops, but police hadn't been able to track them down, so they made a specific appeal to find the computers.
This individual that contacted us said that after that murder had occurred, he was approached by Fagan and he purchased a number of computers from him.
This extra evidence put Matthew Fagan firmly in the frame as the thief. And just before the trial, another piece of damning evidence came through, this time from Cathy's handbag. Police knew she had it with her when she went to the office, and that it later fell into the hands of a petty thief. Once they'd recovered it, they sent it for testing.
Matthew Fagan's trace evidence in terms of DNA and fingerprints were found on the inside of that bag, on cards and other items in there, cosmetic items.
The frightening thing about Fagan is that actually this is a relatively normal human being prior to the events, and I think that's more alarming in that actually I think that the basic personality traits were not that of a psychopath. With Fagan, we're not dealing with a murderer who is in any sense insane. We're actually, frightening as it is to understand, we're actually dealing with somebody who, prior to his life falling apart, was a relatively sane individual, I think.
New Scotland Yard had all the evidence, but they still had to convince the jury. Matthew Fagan was sacked from research now. 6 months later, and drowning in debt, he returned to the company in order to steal laptops. There, he had a chance encounter with Cathy Marlow, who he didn't expect to meet, and he murdered her simply because she got in his way. He then stole the laptops and went on to sell them. Fagan then created a false alibi, by reporting to police that he'd been mugged and going to hospital to have his head injuries treated.
You can never prejudge how a jury will react or how they will analyse that evidence. So you just don't know. I had total confidence that I'd done as much as I could to put a good case before the court.
Fagan pleaded not guilty. In court, he blamed other people for the murder. He accused suspect number 2, the man who had found Cathy's handbag, and then tried to use her card, but he'd been eliminated from the inquiry.
By pleading not guilty, Matthew Fagan was denying, certainly to the jury, that he'd had any involvement in this brutal murder. He'd remained extremely calm that night, so he'd gone to try and sell the computers, having been to the hospital. Most people who had been involved in a murder of quite the violent nature of this one, you might have thought might have had a reaction to it. And he maintained that when he gave evidence in an entirely dispassionate way, of course saying he hadn't been involved. And by virtue of his not guilty plea, there was no room for him to express any remorse because he was denying any involvement.
Suspect number 1, Cathy's friend who had found her body, gave an emotional account at the trial. Eventually, Fagan took the stand.
He went into the witness box to give evidence in his own defence, and in doing so, he put himself at risk of being cross-examined, and because he'd constructed a number of lies, and we could say that they were lies, it was open to our counsel to do a very good job of deconstructing his whole story.
In giving his account, he seemed rather stuck on his explanation as to his movements and where he must have been. And that was entirely inflexible and really didn't reflect the other evidence, the absence of anything to support the fact that he himself had been robbed. And it was rather a wooden performance.
Fagan doesn't think he's guilty. Don't get me wrong, he knows that he committed this murder intellectually. He's not insane. But he doesn't think it's his fault. He thinks he is entitled, that this was a legitimate response to what has happened to him. So on some level, he doesn't think he's guilty.
Fagan insisted he was not guilty. He felt he could convince the jury of his innocence.
I think he thought he was more intelligent than the people that were interviewing him. I think he thought he was more clever than he was, and I think that was potentially part of his psychology for giving evidence in his own defence. But the plan backfired because we had very good prosecution counsel that was able to just, tear his stories apart.
Matthew Fagan was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years.
During the trial, I'd had a lot of contact with Cathy Marlow's family. They'd come from New Zealand. They'd wanted, as they're perfectly entitled to have, an explanation as to how the trial was going to progress and what the issues were. They were remarkably stoical throughout the trial. They were extremely pleased that there had been a conviction, whilst often it's the reaction that there could be a longer sentence. They did appreciate that the sentence that was passed was a very long sentence indeed.
It was quite an emotional moment. I was sat next to Debbie Marlow, Catherine's sister. Brendan was there, Catherine's brother, and Bernard, Catherine's father, was there. As I recollect, we hugged each other, which was probably not very professional in the court, but I think emotions slightly took over. But, I was really pleased for the family because, okay, that's not going to bring Catherine back, but actually the next best thing is that you understand what's happened and who's responsible.
Sadly, Cathy's mum, who had been terminally ill, passed away before she saw justice handed down.
Today's verdict will bring some closure in seeing that justice has been served. However, it won't bring our Catherine back. She lives in our hearts and minds every day. We have lost our Catherine. She has gone forever, and that will never change.
The horror of this story is that it wasn't about Cathy. It wasn't about attacking Cathy. Cathy got in the way. And I think Cathy's innocence, Cathy's naivety, Cathy's optimism, Cathy's gutsy fighting back mentality served to antagonise Fagan further. Somebody who has given up on everything, who is cynical, who feels total bitterness at the world, to then encounter somebody in a pink fluffy scarf, somebody saying, no, don't do that, somebody plucky, fighting back, would have driven his rage to a point of no return.
Matthew Fagan pleaded not guilty and continued to blame other people, but he didn't get away with it. The jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to 26 years in jail. For the detectives of New Scotland Yard, it was a triumph of patience, perseverance, and scrupulously detailed forensic work. For Cathy's family in New Zealand, they got justice, but as her father later said, it will never take away the horror and the suffering that Fagan caused.